Chapter 6. Jailbreak. Tom saw that he was trapped. When he anxiously looked around for some way out, he noticed that Scout was no longer trotting along behind the wagon. The dog had run ahead, his nose to the ground, as though on someone's trail. Had Scout found the scent of Bert and Carl? The dog ran on, still sniffing the ground. He ran straight toward the town tower and stopped at the door. Lifting his head high, he bayed loudly. A few seconds later, the wagon creaked right by the tower. A huge leafy branch from a gigantic chestnut tree passed over Tom's head, and quickly he rose up, seized the big branch, and hoisted himself onto it. Swaying and squeaking, the wagon rode on without him. He was hidden among the leaves of the giant tree, and although he wasn't very comfortable, he was safe for the time being. He slowly climbed a little higher until he felt confident that no one would spot him among the leaves. Then he called to Scout, who was standing beneath the tree barking, to be quiet and wait. The German shepherd obediently lay down in the shade of the foot of the tree. Tom made himself as comfortable as he could in the fork of a big branch and also settled back to wait. He studied the nearby tower. Beside it was a low brick building that looked much newer than the rest. The windows contained bars, so that was probably the local jail. The square was almost deserted now. Almost everyone had hurried home because the sky was growing dark and threatening. In the distance, Tom could already see lightning, and between the flashes, he heard the faint rumble of thunder. Across the square, a policeman carrying a wooden box headed straight for the tower. Anxiously, Tom looked at Scout, but he didn't move from his place beneath the tree, and the policeman paid no attention to him. At the tower door, he produced a large key and went inside, leaving the door open. Tom listened carefully for any sound he could pick up. After a few seconds, he heard the squeak of another door being opened. Then he thought he heard voices, but he couldn't understand the words. Suddenly, Tom heard Carl's shrill voice crying angrily, "That's not true! That's not true!" And he knew for certain that his friends were there. A few minutes later, the man came out again. He carefully locked the door behind him, dropped the key back into his pocket, and recrossed the square. Tom watched him, at the same time noticing how much darker it had become. The sun had completely disappeared behind the dark, churning clouds, bringing an early dusk. As the policeman turned off the main street, the deserted square was lit up by the white glare of lightning. The thunder rolled long and deep, like the growl of a hungry bear. The leaves of the huge chestnut tree began to rustle. The wind was rising and was blowing the thunderstorm straight toward the village. High in the tree, Tom felt the branches beginning to shake, and the air suddenly cooled, sending a shiver down his back. Yet his mind was on his friends in the jail and not on the approaching storm. He had to come up with a plan now, before it became completely dark. It was no accident that he had ended up in this tree next to the building where his friends were being held. He had to help them. He studied the old door of the tower. It was coated with iron plating, and he knew he'd never get it open. The windows in the newer part were made of frosted glass, except for a narrow row of panes at the top. They were protected by sturdy bars, ruling out escape by that route. Again, lightning flashed. In the bright light, Tom spotted something that gave him an idea. The jail had a flat roof, and one of the branches of the chestnut tree overhung the building. Tom had noticed all this before, but now he saw that in the tower, about 2 meters above the flat roof, was a small window that was open. If he could get from the tree onto the flat roof, he should be able to reach the windowsill and pull himself up on it. If the window could be opened a little further, he might be able to climb through it. He knew it would be a difficult and dangerous climb, and he would have to wait until it became a little darker to avoid being seen. Meanwhile, how could he signal his plan to Bert and Carl? He whistled a couple of times, using the familiar signal they always used, but the rustling of the leaves and the rumble of the thunder, which was almost continuous now, drowned out the sound. He had to try something else. He picked a handful of young green chestnuts, and one by one he tossed them against the window of the building below. Not long afterwards, he thought he heard some banging in the jail. Had his friends caught on that he was trying to get their attention? He tossed another chestnut against the glass, and another, and then another. It was so dark that he could see very little. He couldn't have seen through the fogged glass anyway, and the clear windows were too high for his friends to reach. Yet suddenly he thought he saw movement behind one of them. He edged even closer to the window, parting the leaves to get a better look. The branch he was sitting on cracked dangerously. Again, bright lightning lit up everything for a fraction of a second. In the light, Tom saw Carl staring up at him through the window, his eyes wide with astonishment. It was only for a split second, and it was dark again, but Tom thought he had seen a glimmer of recognition on his friend's face. While the thunder rolled over the village, Tom wondered how Carl had managed to reach the top windows. He guessed that he had been standing on Bert's shoulders. Now they knew that he was nearby and would be counting on him to help them. Tom decided that he could wait no longer. It was dark enough. He climbed higher in the tree and selected a branch which hung over the flat roof. Carefully, he inched forward. The branch cracked alarmingly, but it didn't break. The lightning blazed without let-up. He had never seen such a violent thunderstorm. Although he was preoccupied with his plan, he couldn't help shuddering a little at the awesome spectacle. The storm was directly overhead, and the thunder was deafening. Lowering himself slowly, he could just about reach the roof. He let go and landed on the roof on all fours. He had made it, but he knew that this was only the first and the easiest step of his plan. Scrambling up, he tiptoed to the tower wall. The bright flashes blinded him, so that he staggered and groped about in the darkness. Finally, his outstretched hands met the rough stone wall. At the same time, the lightning again lit up the sky, and he saw that he was standing right under the window. But it was higher than he had thought. He couldn't reach it. He felt the stone wall. The seams between the stones didn't offer much of a handhold. He couldn't climb the wall. The only thing he could do was to jump up and try to grab the windowsill and then pull himself up. The seams would offer a bit of a toehold to his sandaled feet. Would it work? His heart thumped loudly. He couldn't know until he tried it. Dropping into a crouch, he jumped, shooting up like a tightly coiled spring. His fingers found the sill, and his feet clawed the wall for a toehold. He clung to the wall of the massive tower like a small spider. Calling on all his strength, he pulled himself up. Supporting himself with one hand, he tried to open the window a little farther with the other. At just that moment, a jagged streak of fire seared the black sky, immediately followed by a thunderclap so loud the world seemed to split asunder. Tom lost his grip and he tumbled backward off the wall. He crashed onto the roof, crying out in pain. The shock of the fall and the violence of the thunderstorm left him trembling from head to foot. The last lightning flash had been terrifying. It must have struck somewhere nearby, he thought. Slowly, his nervous trembling was beginning to subside, but his fear was still with him. Then the words of Psalm 29, which he had heard his father read so often, came to his mind. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord thunders over the mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. In his heart, awe strove to overcome fear. Was the Lord angry at him? Was he doing something wrong? His friends were innocent. He still lay flat on his stomach, overwhelmed by a feeling of powerlessness. He folded his hands, and as the thunder boomed again, he whispered words that carried farther than the mighty roar of the thunder. The prayer calmed Tom. He sat up and thought, what should he do now? His friends had seen him in the tree and must be waiting in great suspense to see what he would do. Should he try it again? Surely he should be able to get through the window. Or should he give up his attempt? At that moment, a large raindrop hit his forehead. It was beginning to rain. Tom made his decision. He didn't want to stay on the roof any longer, nor did he want to abandon his friends. Again, he made a determined leap at the windowsill. His fingers found a grip, and he pulled himself up. This time, he made no mistake. He pushed the window open farther and squeezed his upper body through. The inside of the tower was shrouded in blackness. He groped around with his hands, but all he felt was the wall. When another flash of lightning lit up the space near the window, Tom saw the steps of a stone stairway several centimeters beyond the reach of his groping hand. He wormed his way farther inside and put his hand on the steps. Then he slowly slid all the way through the window. It was a dangerous maneuver, for his hands had to bear all his weight. Carefully, he pulled in one foot, then the other. At last, he was lying safely on the stairs. His forehead was beaded with sweat, but he was seized by a feeling of triumph. He had done it. Cautiously, he descended the stairs into the darkness. A few moments later, he was standing on a floor or landing. He had to see where he was. Digging a box of matches from his pocket, he struck one and held up the tiny flame in the darkness. That had to be the door leading into the jail. It was lined with iron like the outside door. 2 bolts held it locked. The match went out as he tiptoed forward to the door. When he put his ear to it, he heard his friends speaking in low voices. Quietly, he slid back the heavy bolts and reached and pushed the door. It didn't budge. Tom's heart raced with fear and frustration. Had all his efforts been in vain? With trembling fingers, he lit another match to examine the door a little closer. By the light of the flickering flame, he found the keyhole and could see that the door was locked. That was why the door didn't open. What should he do now? If that policeman had taken the key with him, he might as well give up. Then all his work had been for nothing. He struck another match and moved it along the wall. Then he saw it. At the right of the door, at eye level, a small hook jutted from the wall, and on the hook hung a large key. He snatched it from the wall and jabbed at the lock, but his hand was shaking so badly he couldn't get the key in the keyhole. Was it the key to some other door? He took a deep breath to calm himself, and then he tried again. Finally, he managed to get it into the keyhole. Please let it be the right key, he prayed silently. Now try to turn it. He twisted the key in the lock, and smoothly, quietly, the lock opened. When he pushed against the door this time, it opened easily. He peered into the jail. It was also completely dark, but not as dark as the tower. A little light filtered in through the windows, and in the faint light, he could see his friends sitting on 2 cots that served as beds. Apparently, they had heard nothing until he opened the door. They sat frozen in their places, staring at the door to see who was coming in. A flash of lightning lit up the room, and in that brief instant, Bert and Carl saw that it was Tom. With a whoop of joy, they leaped up and ran to him, almost stumbling over each other. They grabbed his hands, pounded his shoulders, and hugged him. Carl was almost in tears. Bert and Carl told Tom they had been in great suspense since they had seen him in the chestnut tree, but thought he had little chance to break them out. When the thunderstorm had come up, they were convinced that Tom had been forced to seek shelter somewhere. They hadn't been able to sleep, however, and had sat on the edge of their cots talking. Tom soon put an end to their conversation. They could talk much later. Now they had to get out of here as quickly as they could. The summer nights were short, and they had to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the village before daybreak. Bert and Carl realized that Tom was right. Quickly they left the dark, gloomy holding tank. Tom locked the door behind them and hung the key back in its place. Then they climbed the stone stairs to the open window. It was still raining, but not as hard as when Tom had climbed in, and the thunder and lightning had almost stopped. Climbing out was easier than getting in, especially because now they could give one another a hand. Tom went first, then Carl, and finally Bert. Soon they were standing side by side on the flat roof. Bert and Carl breathed deeply. They were free again. But as they stood and looked across the village square, they could see a dark figure hurrying straight toward the tower.